Good evening. Thank you, everybody, for logging on and joining the Empire Station Coalition's last webinar in our public forum series, The Alternatives for Penn Station. The Empire Station Coalition is composed of 12 civic organizations working in the areas of transportation, urban planning, small business advocacy, housing, neighborhood livability, and historic preservation. The coalition is opposed to former Governor Cuomo's Empire Station complex, which requires demolishing the blocks around Penn Station, including many historic buildings, to make way for what is being called Tornado Campus. This is our fourth and final webinar in our public forum series, but don't worry, there may be more in the future. The focus tonight is the anti-urban madness of the proposed Empire Station complex. We're going to run through 5 brief presentations. At the end, there will be a live Q&A. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and enter them in the Q&A box. Our first speaker is Lynn Ellsworth, Chair of Human Scale NYC, who is going to discuss monoliths versus a human scale city.
Okay, hi. Let me share my screen so we can do my presentation. Let's see. Okay, so I'm Lynn Ellsworth. As Kirsten already said, I'm with Human Scale NYC. We're a network of over 100 civic and neighborhood organizations. And our mission is to promote neighborhood livability, democratic control over the built environment, and human scale urbanism. Please visit our website. You can see it here, and that's our landing page with a petition you can sign. So this is a rendering of the general project plan that we are opposing around Penn Station. Note how the 9 new Vornado towers in blue are really an extension of Hudson Yards just to the west of the towers. And this is an example of what Vornado is fantasizing about with for its new towers. They want one of them to look like the image on the above right, and they show renderings of Facebook occupying one of these towers as a private Facebook campus within the larger set of towers that Vornado calls its own private Vornado campus. It's kind of an attempt to privatize the entire realm. Now, these are just speculative renderings, and I have heard that Facebook has already rented out all of the office space in the newly renovated Farley post office. So all those towers are going to do substantial darkening of the city. I think many of you might have seen this image already. It's the shadow fan of all those towers that reaches all the way to New Jersey. But I want to step back in time for a minute, back to 1900, when we decided as a city to let the Penn Station be built here on an 8-acre site of which the old city was demolished. That part of the city was filled with factories and tenement buildings. There were 1,500 people displaced. There was one holdout for a while, shown on the bottom right, who eventually sold to the railroad company. But then when the station was finished in 1910, look what we got as a city in exchange for that pain. We got one of the greatest public spaces in the world, in the words of people like Paul Goldberger and other critics and historians in the documentaries about Penn Station. Look particularly at the great permeability of this station to the public along from these wide sidewalks into the station along the side here. This is a station that is open to the city. Richard Cameron's proposal for a new Penn Station is even more permeable. It had great views to the Wonder City as you stepped outside of it on 34th Street, views that are threatened by the new Vornado project. It had a spectacular carriageway to arrive by taxi. It had shoeshine guys scattered all around, and it even had a women's only waiting room with a clothes changing room. Here's one of the famous waiting areas and a shot of someone in one of the snack bars. There was music during the holidays and lots of places for soldiers to sleep in while waiting for trains. See if that image comes up. Oh. The place had restaurants and snack bars, a shopping arcade shown here on the lower right, in a little fuzzy picture is the drugstore that it had within that arcade. The restaurant on the right on the left seated 500 people, and despite its fancy looks, it had a reasonable menu. There was a bus station right outside. And it blended into the old city around it. And as would the newer towers that would eventually come around it, the masonry towers that would come up. But look at the immensity of the public sidewalk here. And a few years later, they would build a post office by the same architect as the station, and it also is greatly permeable to the city. The station itself employed some 3,000 people, from security guards to bellhops to cooks in the restaurants and snack bars. Its public spaces and public purpose created great urbanity. Great spaces that are public inspire us, they enrich our daily life, and they make our city better. They create joy. The spillover effects from the station were huge. Soon, big masonry hotels sprang up opposite the station. Notice how the Hotel Pennsylvania, by the same architect, honored the station in its ground floor design. This is the lobby of the Hotel Pennsylvania, now threatened, of course. And this is even one of the rooms just a few years ago before Renato shut the hotel functioning down. And right next to the Hotel Pennsylvania is what now is called the Hotel Stewart, but back then it was called the Hotel Governor Clinton. It had 1,200 rooms. And what you see here is the a ball held by the transit union workers of New Jersey. They're having their annual celebration here. And this little coffee shop was in the lobby of the Hotel Clinton Stewart. And bragging about their proximity to the station was the Sloan House YMCA, which was a magnificent building, it's still there, and it was at the time the largest YMCA in the country. For those who couldn't afford the hotels Pennsylvania and Stewart, the Y was a great spot for soldiers, sailors, Marines, and transient civilians. It was hugely popular as servicemen during World War II, but it became both a youth hostel and a dormitory for students. I even stayed there for 2 months when I first lived here in New York City. But the railroad was losing money as people were switching to cars. Such short-term thinking led the Penn Railroad to decide to sell the air rights above the station and get rid of it. It's kind of tragic when you think about that now we want people back on the trains and out of cars. So the decision came in 1955 to demolish Penn. They would sell the air rights and it would soon be gone. And it would be replaced by this. This is what happened when the station was demolished. And we got this. These are failed public spaces by any measure. People use them only out of necessity, and there is a decided tendency to flee the area if you don't have to be there. And no amount of umbrellas is going to fix this public mess here. So we are faced with a fundamental dilemma. What kind of city do we want? Here is an image of the future city in Disney's imagination from its famous film, Tomorrowland. This fantasy of glass and steel has long been promoted by the real estate industry and its allies. Back in 1928, the Regional Plan Association described a plan to rid Manhattan below 59th Street of poor people and of manufacturing and replace it all with highly congested office space instead. They wrote that, quote, the value of concentration is so great that buildings of practically unlimited height and bulk should be allowed to rise on private land, and the city should incur the cost of widening the streets, of building elevated streets and sidewalks, and of providing airport sites on rooftops. We should plan, they said, to facilitate more concentration and to realize the full attainment of a skyscraper city. The image in black and white here is their idea of a future Manhattan. The only thing is, this towerization strategy requires huge amounts of demolition of historic buildings that have long served to create the great streetscape that once made New York known as the Wonder City. Their replacement with glass towers adds nothing to the public realm and only takes from it. The Wonder City, to use that to the real estate industry, would have to be replaced. So what is happening is a kind of massive privatization of the Sky Dome. Even the sidewalks and streets are getting privatized in this model, with BIDs, business improvement districts, controlling and patrolling the streets and the sidewalks as Vornado turns entire chunks of our city into its own campus. This has been happening everywhere on an incremental basis. They are asking to destroy lots of great old buildings around the station for more of this kind of development. We see One Vanderbilt over on the left, and we see Hudson Yards on the right. But if you walk around New York, you see this everywhere. But we can do better. We have designed for the public realm before and for the public good before. It can happen again. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Next, we have John Massengale of Congress for New Urbanism, who's going to provide historical perspective and new alternatives.
Once upon a time in New York, there lived a genius named Jane. She was an activist, an author, and an observer. She particularly observed life in Greenwich Village, where she lived, and she soon realized that the urban renewal projects she was writing about for various magazines were destroying wonderful neighborhoods like the one where she lived, replacing them with non-places. She called the process urban removal. So she wrote a great book about what made her neighborhood a good place to live. President Obama called it the great book on cities. In Death and Life, Jane asked, "What's the first thing you see when you visit a city?" And her answer was, "Streets and their sidewalks, the main public spaces of a city, are its most vital organs. Think of a city and what comes to mind? Its streets. If a city's streets look interesting, the city looks interesting. If they look dull, the city looks dull." So what do we see today when we walk around Penn Station? This view shows what the Starchitect Rem Koolhaas calls junk space. It came after urban removal took away the buildings that enclosed the street, and the streets turned into machine space, a space for moving cars and trucks, not a place for humans to live city life. But streets are about more than transportation, especially when they're right next to a great train station in a great city where most of the residents don't own cars. A lot of city life takes place in public spaces. Here in New York, we don't have as many squares and plazas as European cities have. 3/4 of the public space in New York is in our streets, the space between the buildings. And before King Carr took over and what's good for General Motors became good for America, we used our streets very differently. This is a view of Fifth Avenue next to Madison Square, when a temporary arch celebrated Admiral Dewey. Here's a view of Broadway at Herald Square in 1908, looking north towards Times Square. The low building on the right is the New York Herald building, another building designed by McKimby and White that's lost to history. When we zoom in, you can see that most of the people are over on the sidewalk, but that there are also people out in the street waiting for the cable car that ran up and down Broadway. And you can see that the people crossed the street wherever they wanted. Pedestrians, cable cars, motor cars, and horse-drawn wagons all shared the space. Everyone had to accommodate the slowest and most vulnerable, the pedestrians. 100 years later, this is the hottest topic in street design, called shared space. No matter how far we zoom in, you won't see any stoplights, stop signs, or crosswalks. In fact, you won't see any traffic signs or any paint marking travel lanes or parking spaces for cars, because none of those things had been invented yet. Now, cities like London and Paris are going back to the future and sometimes removing all the traffic engineering detritus. That was in 1909. The Model T Ford went into production a year before in 1908, and the world rapidly changed. The coalition of car companies and oil companies that called themselves Organized Motordom realized that if they wanted to sell lots of cars, they had to claim the streets for the free flow of traffic. In 1908, the sidewalks on Fifth Avenue were wider than the roadbed. In 1909, the city reversed that proportion, giving more space to the cars to make what the New York Times called New York's greatest driveway. They kicked the pedestrians to the side of the road, added stoplights, and made it illegal for people on foot to cross the road anywhere but at the corner. And it only got worse after that. Jane Jacobs looked at road widenings like this one on Lexington Avenue and saw other ways that we were making the streets worse for people. This shows what she called a border vacuum, which is bad for city streets. I'll explain. It's actually easy to make a street what people want to be. It has to be safe, interesting, and comfortable, with things to do and places to go. Comfortable usually means that it feels enclosed, with the space between the buildings not being too large. Interesting means that beauty is good and ugly is bad. We know for a fact that people walking go out of their way to avoid ugliness. The buildings shaping the street don't have to be low. New York has great streets with wonderful tall buildings. Broad Street is one of the best public spaces in America. Here's a mid-block view of what Vornado calls the Penn Station campus. This is not one of the great public spaces in America. It's a place that people avoid if they can, and it even kills pedestrian life on the other side of the street. It's partly a product of New York City's 1961 zoning resolution. Tall glass towers became more important than making a comfortable street. For street geeks like me, it's interesting that the zoning resolution came out the same year that Jacobs published Death and Life. The two are night and day. The street feels wide and dangerous with speeding traffic. Public space is eroded. The mid-block entrance to Penn Station and Madison Square Garden feels like a dark and ugly hole. No one wants to walk here, but this is the introduction to New York City for many who arrive by train. What about the surrounding streets? This view of 6th Avenue in Midtown shows how the New York State Economic Development Corporation want to fix what they call the blight around Penn Station. But Penn Station is the blight. Jane wrote way back in Death and Life that these glass boxes are boring and that they make boring streets. And she was right. And here's the most quoted line in urban design. We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. That line from Winston Churchill is repeated so often because it's true. Neuroscientists, psychologists, and sociologists confirm that architecture affects our happiness and well-being. 8th Avenue and 34th Street are the same width as 2nd Avenue and 86th Street, where this photo was taken. Right now, they're all what we call auto sewers. And most of the time, the traffic doesn't even flow well, which is their whole reason for being. Cities and the buildings and streets and squares that make them are among the greatest achievements of humanity. We want to pass them on to our descendants. We don't want to pass on inhumanly scaled, climate-killing cities that make the world worse now and in the future. There are many ways to make New York City's streets safer, less noisy, less polluted, and better for city life. Here's another one of those ways. There's a revolution going on. We are starting to use our streets differently. This, of course, is a photo of 5th Avenue next to Madison Square, the same place that had the arch in the middle of the street a century ago. But the evolution of the revolution is slow. The street is incrementally better than the streets we were building 20 years ago, but it's still a street for moving cars in and out of the city. If we had more time, I could explain how this is really a suburban-style transportation corridor in the middle of the city. It says to suburbanites, come on in, bring your car, our streets are just like yours. By the way, if you want to know what bad feng shui feels like, just stand at an intersection on a New York City street when the traffic light changes. But time is up. So if you're interested in learning more about what Jane Jacobs said and did, there's lots more in the Death and Life of Great American Cities, and in books about Jane, like Roberta Gratz's The Battle for Gotham. As an activist, Jane Jacobs was the first private citizen to stop Robert Moses, and she was a preservationist who made the Greenwich Village Historic District a model for what historic districts should be. There's much to learn from St. Jane, the patron saint of CNU NYC. Thank you. Once upon
Next, we have George Calderaro, an advisory member of Historic Districts Council, who is going to talk about our most precious historical assets that are in danger of demolition.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'll briefly outline historic assets and preservation issues at hand in the Cuomo-Vornado Realty proposal that even Bill de Blasio, no preservationist he, describes as a land grab. Next, please. As you've heard, our coalition is opposed to the scheme to level blocks of Midtown around Penn Station, containing up to 50 viable historic buildings, notably including the Hotel Pennsylvania by McKim, Mead and White, who designed the original Penn Station, of course. Next, please. It's time to learn from our mistakes and end Moses-era tactics of declaring a functioning community blighted and using eminent domain to bypass the public process and destroy historic buildings and vibrant communities. As Senator Liz Krueger reasonably asks, when did Andrew Cuomo become Robert Moses? And I'll add, why are we still talking about Andrew Cuomo's and his egomaniacal plots? In addition to 20 million square feet of unneeded commercial office space, the proposal also includes 2 hotels, but does not consider the relatively easy, sustainable, and economical renovation of the 2 great vast hotels it plans to demolish. The Hotel Stewart and the Hotel Pennsylvania, one of the largest hotels in the world with 2,000 rooms when it opened in 1919. Next, please. As you can see, the Hotel Pennsylvania is a monumental structure designed as an integral part of the Pennsylvania Station complex. The hotel's form and function were symbiotic with the magnificent station. The construction and materials of both buildings were designed and built for the ages with massive columns, granite, marble, and brick. Next, please. I have no patience for those who say that the Hotel Pennsylvania is dingy. It's got some soot on it. The so-called blighted condition was created by the owners of Vornado Realty Trust in much the same way that the original Penn Station was not maintained and suffered horrendous interventions by the building owner to the point where the public could not appreciate its magnificence until it was gone. In this context, it's interesting to note that the 2021 Pritzker Prize, the highest international architecture award, was recently given to 2 architects who adaptively reuse buildings. There are too many demolitions of existing buildings which are not old, which still have a life in front of them, and which are not out of use, said architect Anne Lacaton. We think that is too big a waste of materials. If we observe carefully, if we look at things with fresh eyes, there is always something positive to take from an existing situation, end quote. But I and my preservation colleagues are not the only ones who see the obvious value in renovation of this landmark-worthy building. Vornado Realty Trust itself, the largest developer in the city and the 3rd largest in the country, at one point saw the value in preserving and restoring the Hotel Pennsylvania and commissioned plans and renderings by Atelier and Company for renovation of the magnificent hotel. Next, please. These are just a few sketches that were developed to give an idea of what a vibrant hotel could be again. Next, please. That's restoring the 2-story lobby area, which has now been reduced to 1 story, and it's perhaps indeed this is now blighted thanks to Vornado. Next, please. Likewise, this could be opened up. Next, please. Another rendering, to optimizing the extant spaces. Next, please. And finally, a floor plan of the structure and the flow that Lynn was alluding to, which is still intact or could be restored. Next, please. Likewise, the Hotel Stewart is destined for the wrecking ball, despite the fact that it is currently a functioning, recently renovated hotel and another distinguished architectural asset in our community. Next. I include here just a few images of our built heritage that are imminently threatened and what's likely to come, namely vacant lots for years where historic buildings once stood. Next, please. Just this morning, I confirmed with State Senator Brad Hoylman Vornado's plan to demolish the Hotel Pennsylvania and replace it with a parking lot for food trucks, a plan that can only be described as a retrograde act of spite. Next, please. This is the same, the power station, which is also by McKim, Mead and White, which is destined to be destroyed. Next, please. And St. John the Baptist Church and Rectory, likewise doomed with the current plan. Next, please. Next. And this is what's to come. Our community already resembles post-war London, with vast lots left vacant for years, where significant buildings that the New York Landmarks Preservation Commission refused to protect and which were leveled for the sake of glassy, glossy developments that never got built. On the left is the Bancroft building, which was demolished in 2015 and has been the vacant lot that you see on the right since then for 5 or 6 years. In another forum, we need to discuss demolition taxes and tax incentives for keeping historic buildings. On 32nd and 5th, there's a 4-year-old vacant lot where 2 great Beaux-Arts buildings stood for 100 years. Next, please. That's the Caskell building and the neighboring building. We, as a member of the 29th Street Neighborhood Association, garnered 40,000 signatures from around the country to try to save this truly distinctive building. And again, it's been a vacant lot for 4 years, 2 blocks south of the Empire State Building. From 28th to 30th Street, you'll find block-wide 5-year-old vacant lots where great historic buildings once stood. Recently, the presumed developer of one of these block-wide lots went bankrupt. Next, please. And 2 blocks from Penn Station, the magnificent 1890 Demarest building designed by James Renwick is being demolished as we speak. It's on the left, obviously. To quote the architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable, writing in the Times about the destruction of Penn Station, these are, quote, monumental acts of vandalism. New York City must learn from its mistakes and stop destroying historic, viable buildings housing hundreds of businesses and residents to construct unwanted and unneeded towers that only benefit developers or, again, result in vacant lots when ill-conceived plans fall through. Next, please. So join us, sign the human scale petition, and contact your elected officials now or never. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Next, we have Brad Vogel. He's a member of the City Club of New York's Preservation Committee, and he's going to focus on the need for fine-grained assessment of the cultural, architectural, and streetscape values at risk.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. I'm going to share screen now, so bear with me for just one moment. And with luck, that is up. Yes, so I'm here today on behalf of the Preservation Committee for the City Club of New York. And the City Club, of course, for many years has been advocating for all New Yorkers for the promotion of thoughtful urban land use policy. Today, I just wanted to take a step after hearing the great presentation from George Calderaro about the various historic buildings at risk in the site of the proposed Empire State Complex, and go a little bit further, dig a little bit more to that granular level and ask ourselves, aside from the buildings that are designated as worthy of consideration for the state and national register of historic places or for city landmarking, how are we assessing what will in fact be lost when the urban landscape is raised if this proposal goes through? One thing to think about is the possibility of surprise. And I have a picture here of the Gimbel Sky Bridge from the 1930s, which is at risk. This would be lost if the Empire Station complex goes forward as planned. This is the kind of thing that we think about as citizens of New York City. When we are moving through the city, what are the things that make this place worth living? And in the case of the Gimbel Sky Bridge, I personally, and I know many people, have found this to be a rather magical element of the city, a thing that you don't expect necessarily or that you forget is there, but you look up and there is this thing of beauty, finely constructed, rare, something that gives your day, that gives the cityscape meaning and value. So we're taking a look now at the site and things that might be lost along those lines. We're talking about the accretive city This is a city that retains layers of itself in various places, even as it exhibits the dynamism of cities. And I have some examples here from inside the footprint of the proposed complex. These are buildings that are not necessarily of great, national historic significance, but they are buildings that tell the story of the city. They tell the story of the layers, that exhibit adaptive reuse, and they continue to surprise and prove useful as they take on new forms and new uses over time. But these buildings are a great example as well, because in the background, you see that other buildings have been inserted. It's a small surgical insertion, rather than a wholesale radical surgery that wipes out the entire limb. And the site is also full of useful, unheralded buildings. This is the Penn Terminal Complex, very close to Penn Station. And there are many buildings like this that would be demolished under the plan. They are buildings that are currently in use. They are buildings that are primed for additional adaptive reuses down the road. So thinking about the sheer loss of the built environment that we currently enjoy is really important. Buildings are also, George was highlighting buildings that are at risk of direct demolition, and that's what I've focused on thus far as well. But let's recall also that the environmental impact statement for this plan also makes clear that there are many dozens, scores of buildings that would also potentially be at risk for some of the construction-related vibration issues and other adverse impacts and effects. This is one example near the periphery of the proposed footprint. And also the idea of embedded or embodied energy. Again, these are two buildings that are in the site. They are not noted in the environmental impact statement as being worthy of state or national register recognition or city landmarking status, but they are historic structures that embody the work and the energy, the carbon footprint, if you will, of efforts in the past to build this city. And we really do need to be thoughtful. We need to look at this through the lens of what is wise rather than just what is efficient, in considering whether this makes sense, whether this is in fact a sustainable plan, one that comes through and clear cuts many buildings like this. And finally, this final slide, there is over on the side, and it may be hidden behind your sidebar windows, a small sculpture of squirrels on the Stewart Hotel facade. And it's things like this. It's the small things, the things that are not cataloged, the things that are not accounted for, that are part of our built urban environment. And I put this here as a symbol of all of the things that we have not talked about tonight that are at risk in the footprint of the Empire Station complex. I hope that you will join everyone in this coalition in opposing this plan, because we are about vitality, the vitality that comes from a diversity of buildings, a diversity of owners, a diversity of plot sizes, a diversity of building types that makes urban areas worth living in. So we are here because we are for that vitality, and we are certainly against this encroaching sense of fiefdom that should be opposed at all costs. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brad. Next, we have John Mudd. He's Executive Director of Midtown South Community Council, and he will address the consequences of overdevelopment, including the lack of affordable housing, increased homelessness.
Thank you, Kirsten. And thank you all for being here this evening. My name is John Mudd, and I'm with the Midtown South Community Council. We've been serving the community well for over 37 years. Now, I'm here to talk about the consequences of the Empire Station Complex development plan, the impact on people, the impact on housing, and how we may reinvest in a better social contract. Now, the drivers of instability, austerity, bad policies, bad priorities, corporate interests create housing shortages, unaffordable housing, They burden the public with cost, and they create homelessness and poverty, which negatively impacts consumption, education, emotional, mental, physical health, and our quality of life, which ultimately leads to homelessness. Now, who's experiencing homelessness? Well, we have families with children, 53%, adults without children, 42%. They make up the 95% of the sheltered people. Now, the people you see on the streets who are struggling with mental illnesses, they're 5% of the homeless population. Now, the two drivers of reasons for people entering the DHS shelter are domestic violence cases at 41%, evictions and overcrowding at 43%. Homelessness is a policy choice. Housing is the solution. So what are we doing about it? Well, we're overdeveloping. The three developments, the Hotel Bonanza of 2008, where you saw all these hotels blossom in the Midtown area and reached across the city, Hudson Yards, the Empire Station complex yet to come, are representative of an economic system that sacrifices society for the few to prosper. We're producing hotels while 20% are expected to close. 90% of the Hudson Yards tenants are from the Midtown area. Now, ESC will tell you that we need more commercial development for when the crowds come roaring back. But besides shuffling the commercial tenants from Midtown to the Hudson Yards, Midtown is seeing a 19% vacancy among the commercial spaces. Now, the current trend is to work remotely, which saves us enormous cost on office space, travel, clothes, and it adds more quality of time to our lives. The Empire Station complex proposes to create an unprecedented 20 million square feet of commercial office space while destroying neighborhoods and small businesses and historic buildings, thereby worsening the housing and homeless crisis. I mean, this plan will dwarf the Hudson Yards record-setting development. And to do this, they'll use the Hudson Yards playbook. They'll acquire federal funding. They'll trade air rights. They'll obtain pilots, payments in lieu of taxes for projects that bear benefit to the public. They'll get a tax exemption. They'll bet on future tax revenues for financing. The TIFs, the tax increment financing that they used for the Hudson Yards, well, the taxpayers have spent $2.2 billion. They'll take advantage from the 421A tax abatement for building unaffordable housing. Now, housing was not part of ESC's equation until pressed by the public. And then they offered 1,800 mixed income units, of which 540, 30%, will be marketed as permanent affordable housing. Now, this is like giving someone a drop of water after they wandered across the Sahara Desert. Trading 540 affordable apartments for throwing longtime tenants out of their homes and killing close to 500 small businesses is not a fair trade. I mean, this is a negative sum game. Now, to create affordability, the Bloomberg solution was to create these inclusionary zones. Within these zones, developers could designate 20% of all their apartments as affordable housing to receive 33% increase of a project's total floor space. That's 7 additional stories for a 23-story building. Now, so the developers are given high density luxury development rights for the promise of affordable units, which are financed with the public subsidies. But there's a real problem here. The affordable housing market is not affordable. Now, this is a property in called Blue Slip. It's located in Brooklyn. They get a 421A tax subsidy. And they market this on the lottery. Okay, they expect someone who's making $58,000 to rent a studio for over $2,300, or a 1-bedroom for over $2,500. Oh, you can double up in the studio. You can triple up in the 1-bedroom. But I think the dorm lifestyle living should be put behind after you get out of college. Now, a family with 1 full-time worker earning a minimum wage cannot afford the local fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment anywhere in the United States. If you're making $15 an hour, you'd have to work 100 hours to afford an $1,800 apartment. Wealth extraction burdens public and causes homelessness. We got 92,000 New Yorkers that are homeless in New York City. Our social contract is broken. As our flow-through tax dollars find its way into the pockets of developers, services are diminished, affordable housing is none, and displacement is assured. Now, the real cost, when the very basics of our social contract is ignored, people suffer. Gentrification is a cycle of violent displacement. I mean, you can't have a community when the median rent is $3,500 and the median income is around $58,000. You can't build communities by cost burdening the public. I mean, high rents encourage transient dwellers and foreign investments. They encourage illegal hotel operations, Airbnb. They encourage property owners to displace renters. The overdevelopment leads to poor quality of life, but it destroys our society's foundations and structures. We have to rethink our city. We have to invest into a better social contract. We have to balance neighborhoods, sustain small businesses, nurture individual growth, and create harmony. We have to preserve existing affordable units and secure rent regulations, strengthen oversight. We need to invest in really affordable developments that welcome our essential workers, our public service workers, new DAs, college grads, art students, and seniors who are making less than the median wage. Rethink NYC's through running considers a wider, more efficient approach, but more importantly, it will improve people's lives and experience while traveling through the city. Rethinking our transportation is rethinking our city. And with that, I'll end my presentation and thank you.
Thanks so much, John. And last but not least, we have Sam Turvey of Rethink NYC, who's going to briefly discuss a call to action, and then we're going to jump right into Q&A. So again, if you have any questions, just go ahead and put them in the Q&A box.
Yeah, just as we go into the call to action, next slide, please. I do want to give a little bit of an update. Many of you who've seen our invitations to tonight knew that we thought this would be on the eve of the Empire State Development Corporation doing a readout to the Penn Station Community Advisory Committee Working Group, a group that was formed by the governor, and then some other people were added after the public outcry over this proposal earlier in the year. There was going to be a report out on what they would do in response to recommendations made by the Community Advisory Committee Working Group. That, I believe, has been postponed indefinitely, which is interesting, especially as it comes on the same day that Governor Hochul has announced that she wants to see another alternative for the LaGuardia Air Train. So, you know, it's way too early to predict how and why and where this proposal is going, but do know that these things would not be being adjourned if it weren't for the fact that people are raising their hands and saying this is not good enough. And we will see what happens. But in terms of calls to action, if you agree with some of the things we're saying, or most of them, or there are things you find that you are most definitely opposed to in the governor's proposal, please continue to take a public stand with your elected officials. We will send around something after this with their names and addresses. You certainly want to make sure to include the new governor, who just took a real stand on the LaGuardia Air Train, our new mayor. We have a new borough president. And why should we be doing this? You see the picture on the right. You know, we focus on different things at each of these forums. We did through running first. We did moving Madison Square Garden and above ground Penn Station with the last call. And this call, we're focusing on some of the urban elements of the city that we think need to be preserved. And here you have a great picture of the Hotel Pennsylvania being seen leaving the original Penn Station and the Sky Bridge in the distance that Brad showed us such a great picture of. Next slide. So I'll just close before the Q&A, say, obviously, some of you have seen these calls to action before. You can continue to read them. But unfortunately, this great photo of New York City, one of the finest photos I've ever seen of the city, is Demolition Row. Most of this picture is the original Penn Station, which, as you know, was demolished. But there's the Hotel Pennsylvania on the left. If you go catty corner to the station across 31st Street, you see the Hotel Stewart that George referenced. That church steeple you see peeking above the middle of Penn Station is St. John the Baptist. And the building with the two smokestacks is the Penn Station Power Station. Now, virtually all of these surrounding buildings still exist. The cityscape has changed a bit. There's some taller hotels on 6th Avenue now below 29th Street, but we can have a human scale city. We can have a fine city. We are going to need to fight for it. So please heed our call to action and let's all keep at this. But we will now go to the Q&A.
Thanks, Sam. And if everyone can please turn on their cameras. The first question came from Kevin Pizzuti. His question is, with Andrew Cuomo gone, does it make any obstacles easier to overcome?
Sam, you want to take that one?
I like to be nice to Andrew since we graduated from Fordham College together, but I do think it makes it easier. He had a rather large thumb on the scale for this project, and also didn't, by reputation and by his own admission, didn't suffer opposing viewpoints. And with him out, I think we've already seen a whole host of elected officials, civic leaders, and others take a more vocal and repeated stand here, and we're hoping that some of that can flow through to a pivot in this project where they either shelve it or do something like they did with the L train and just really go back to the drawing board and do something that makes a lot more sense.
Not to be negative, but I should note that both Governor Hochul and presumed Mayor Adams are crisscrossing each other on the Long Island Expressway on and back and forth to the Hamptons to shake down real estate developers. There's another article today about that for her gubernatorial campaign and his mayoral campaign. And also I'll point out that Eric Adams has said that he wants to upzone at least all of Manhattan from 14th to 42nd Street.
Thanks, George. Anonymous attendee asked, rebuilding the original Penn Station is very divisive. Have you considered green building, sustainability, and climate action in this proposal?
I'll take a little bit of that. So I guess we disagree that rebuilding Penn Station is divisive in the sense that there seem to be a lot of organizations and people who believe in the idea and think it makes sense when you consider the ensemble of problems we've got here. We have a project of 10 towers that we're trying to stop. We have the issue of how do you fix Penn Station so that it functions in the future? How do you create a regional through-running system that distributes economic prosperity throughout the region in an equitable way? And then how do you restore some sense of urban greatness to this neighborhood that is suffering from the current Madison Square Garden and the current Penn Plaza buildings? So on the environmental side, I noticed that there is an environmental impact statement for this project, the Vornado project. It's on the website of the Empire State Development Corporation. And, they do a very rough, very poor accounting of the carbon situation for the Vornado project. They estimate something like 1.4 million metric tons over 6 years of construction emission carbons. They don't talk about the carbon lost from the demolition of all these buildings. They talk about 68 million tons of carbon generated just by traffic in building the 10 towers. And they talk about how the eventual 10 towers will have 75 to 150,000 per year of carbon emissions. It's very hard to make glass buildings, even if you LEED Platinum certify them, to make them efficient in carbon emissions. So there's that sort of set of problems. And then, I think that Richard Cameron, in his proposal for an above ground station, has talked a great deal about making it energy efficient. He's talked about geothermal possibilities. And, I think that this hasn't been explored adequately and is part of the this coalition's advocacy, is that we would like the alternative to be legitimately considered and not dismissed by people who say it's just not possible or it's just far-fetched, which we know that it is not far-fetched. It's simply plausible if you decide you want to do it politically.
Yeah, I just say also on a divisive issue. I mean, I understand, some people say that, but please go to our website, rethink Penn Station NYC.org. We commissioned a poll with a very reputable polling company, and there were numbers well north of 60% in favor of rebuilding the station like the original Penn Station. So this isn't just some whim we take lightly. And those are pretty high numbers because in New York City, we're a fairly opinionated city. So I hear what that person is saying, but as Lynn is suggesting, we think it's a legitimate alternative that people should, as Lynn said, democratically have the opportunity to consider. And in the past, the RPA issued one of their big reports within the past 3 or 4 years and only included one proposal, the Sean Chakraborty proposal. I don't think that's fair. I think the city deserves to see any number of proposals. And while we didn't spend as much time at our program last week on other proposals, we did include other proposals, which is more than usually happens for us. So we're all about a full and complete conversation. And to the extent that majority holds, and 60 to 65% of New Yorkers who want to see something akin to the original Penn Station through to fruition, we think that their vote should be honored.
Thanks, Sam. Next question is Margaret McEnroe. Thank you, everyone. As a neighbor in West 34th Street, I strongly agree with George and Brad. Have there been efforts to seek protection on a federal level or with UNESCO?
Well, the federal level won't protect anything anyway. It's an honorific. The National Register of Historic Places confers no protection. It's only the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission which has rejected all of the buildings that are being proposed for demolition. And likewise, I'm sure with UNESCO.
I would like to toss in a thought there that just occurred to me as George was speaking, is that I did hear from a national preservation official that one potential benefit is that if you have federal money coming in for a transportation project and it affects your building that's nationally, you have to do major federal EIS and you have to really consider the impact on these sort of federally designated assets. So it could put in could slow things down a little bit if we tried that.
Okay, thanks, Lynn and George. The next question comes from Stephen Marmon. Doesn't it make sense to build new office buildings at the corners of 34th and 7th and 34th and 8th, given that both sites are currently occupied by 1 2-story temporary structures? Yes, save the 2 hotels and the many other good old buildings, but both of those sites seem to be smart location for new offices, residences, and hotels.
I'll just say that I think Richard Cameron has an idea for a couple of towers over there. There's a lot of discussion of how tall they should be or how big they should be, but Sam, I don't know, you want to respond to that a little bit?
The Rethink New York City has not discussed those 2 towers. Richard has, and we should, if Richard's on, we might want to promote him to a panelist, but Richard has shown towers of varying heights there. His most recent iteration were towers that would be maybe half the height of the Empire State Building. But we are increasingly talking about this, doing things within the existing zoning footprint. While I wouldn't say personally, not on behalf of any of the organizations on the phone, that I am opposed to every super tall that might ever be created, they would have a high burden of proof for me. I think some of you saw the articles in the paper about the residential towers this week. They got certificates of occupancy before they should have. They're not working. There's a whole host of problems with them. And so I think we need to find how to strike the right balance, but I certainly don't think we need to have one-story post-war buildings on those two corners. There is some room for development there, and hopefully that can help us avoid tearing down some of the buildings I showed you in that great night shot.
Thanks, Sam. Next question is from Roberta Gratz. Thank you for joining us. Do you know how many businesses and residences exist in both landmarked and unlandmarked buildings? You're missing the most critical issue of appeal to the largest audience, the destruction of existing small and modest-sized businesses and thousands of jobs. No one loves landmarks more than I do, but the larger public needs to know the impact on people, businesses, and affordable residences.
I'll jump in a little bit on that. Yes, this is incredibly important. You must have missed our first webinar where we focused very intensely on this particular problem. I think there are 400 families being evicted. I'm forgetting the number of businesses, but I do recall that 10,000 small business jobs are at stake here, about to be evicted and their places demolished. We have also literally walked around with flyers to all the buildings, walked into lobbies, posted flyers, contacted residents and small businesses. We have started a residents committee, the Penn Area Residents Committee that Omri presides over. A resident is on the Community Advisory Council that Cuomo appointed, Eugene, and he has been fierce on his role at that committee. So I think we've done our best. I think one thing where we sort of didn't get a lot of response from our flyers and stuff was the small businesses occupying the upper levels of all these big buildings. Several times we went in and we couldn't even get past the ground floor. We couldn't get up the stairwells. That work is ongoing, and we would certainly appreciate any help from anyone in the audience in reaching out to the small businesses affected by this. It was pretty easy to reach out to the ground floor businesses though.
Thanks. Next question, anonymous. Excuse me. Existing office towers are more adaptable to other uses, especially residential, compared to the typical office towers with their large footprint, a current topic of great importance in New York City. Is this an issue raised as part of this resistance?
Yes, and I think we should let John Massengale answer that.
So I'm going to say, could you repeat that one time, Kirsten?
I put it in the chat, but existing office towers are more adaptable to other uses, especially residential, compared to the typical office towers with their large footprint, a current topic of great importance in New York City. Is this an issue raised as part of this resistance?
Well, first of all, most European countries won't allow what we call a Class A office building because they think they're bad for office workers as well as residential. They are to have, the reason we are converting old office buildings into apartments are twofold. One is you can get more light into the building, and two, we have too much office space in New York City. If there are two building types we don't need, it's luxury and super luxury apartments and Class A office buildings. They're both overbuilt. In this case, Vornado would not build these without a subsidy from the state of the eminent domain.
Thanks, John. Next questions from Meta Franzima. Is it possible to avoid the demolition on the block south of Penn Station and still have the station expansion linked to the Gateway project?
We'll give that to Corinne.
Yeah, I would say, sorry, could you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. Is it possible to avoid the demolition on the block south of Penn Station and still have the station expansion linked to the Gateway project?
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a technical question in the sense that expansion is a sensitive word. The Rethink proposal is actually an improvement of the existing station to allow wider platforms and have more stairs and escalators. So you can have that same capacity, but without the need to take over more land.
Thank you, Karim. Next question. I'm so sorry. Well, is this kind of piggybacking off that? Will some of the buildings you're discussing be demolished as part of the gateway plan?
Some of the buildings would, well, no. Basically, you wouldn't have to demolish these buildings that we're talking about as Penn Station South if you were to do our proposal. To, I believe, Sam's point earlier about, you know, or I might be mistaking who was speaking about, you know, the possibility of having some development there in the future. That's a different story. It wouldn't inhibit or require any changes in those buildings, but it certainly would not require the demolition.
Thanks, Karim. Next question, I guess this could go to Lynn. How is the original Penn Station and the Farley building human scaled? Both contain majestic columns and massive spaces. Why would you characterize that as human scale? They seem to be scaled for giants.
Am I unmuted? Yeah. Well, I guess I don't see them as giants. I see them as ennobling, tall ceilinged spaces that allowed us to grow into who we are as a citizenry walking through the station. They're not super talls. I think for me, human scale, my rough category is about, like, I think, well, anything less than like 8-9 stories is human scale for New York City, right? But we have plenty of really great buildings that are much bigger than that were built long ago. And I'm not suggesting we get rid of any of them. Many of them are beautiful and serve a great role. I think that we're entering a new world where infinite height is being overly celebrated, and we need to pull back from that. And I don't see Penn Station as faulty in that way.
And I'd just like to add that the architecture of Penn Station, Union Station, Washington, D.C., Denver's Union Station, 30th Street Station, and Philadelphia. I mean, this architecture works particularly well for train stations. Those are huge success stories wherever this architecture has been allowed to remain and flourish. And the Penn Station that we had, you know, it graced the books and poetry of Thomas Wolfe, Langston Hughes, J.B. Salinger, Jennifer Egan, to get a little more current. And I have said, I didn't commute through Grand Central Terminal, but and many have heard me say this before, but it's worth repeating. I would cut through there diagonally every day, and I would get a spiritual jolt entering that building that would be the envy of any organized religion. And that you know, it gets more philosophical than human scale, but these are wonderful buildings that grace cities, and they ennoble and empower people. And if you listen to Alex Washburn last week talk about his own learning of how important that station was to a kid from Hell's Kitchen named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and how much it was part of his democratization and civilization, that's what great architecture like that is about. So yes, it's grand, but it's modeled after public baths in Rome, and I think we can live with a grandeur that's also very democratic.
Yes, and I'd like to point out that the station was meant to make humans feel great. It's a human space with human accessibility, human permeability, places for us to be everywhere. The scale was meant to make us feel grand, not lost. It's a completely different feeling. Like if you go, you know, just down the street from where I live, there's the new Freedom Tower and all those glass buildings there. And, you know, they're not human scale. They're not meant to make you feel grand. They're meant to make you feel, as Le Corbusier advocated, terrified. He used the word terrified, that they should be pitiless. So you know, Penn Station was not a pitiless place. It was meant to make us feel great, and it did.
Great, thank you, Lynn. An anonymous attendee submitted this question for, I guess, for the Rethink folks. You mentioned creating a through running station. Would that mean combining the services of LIRR and New Jersey Transit? I see trains sitting in the yards all day until peak hours, but would it mean a whole new system to organize?
Yeah, I'll take that. So this is kind of a larger question. I think it was the first of the three town halls that we had. We went into a lot more detail on this. Effectively, what it mean would be that you would basically pair some New Jersey Transit service with Long Island Railroad and Metro North service. And the effect that would give is that from an operations point of view, someone could, for instance, take a train from Long Island to Newark. The exact way that would function from like the operator's perspective, there's a few precedents in the region already. Metro North already has like a different agreement with Connecticut for the New Haven line. There's the New Jersey Transit that turns into the West of Hudson Metro North service. There's the New Haven line that actually is the train to the game, which goes from Connecticut through New York over to New Jersey to the Meadowlands station. So there's a few different models for how that would operate. We're not, married to any one of those. We think that this is the service that we should be striving for in this region. Every other kind of global city has this type of service, and it's about time that New York was having to.
Great, thanks, Karim. Next question is from John Manning. Some of these super tall towers being taken down because they were poorly built and/or there's no great demand, like the unfinished tower on Maiden Lane near the river. Excuse me. If we could pull that off, would it set a precedent?
Yes, I think it would be fabulous. I saw a movie in Tokyo, this is rapid, where they managed to take down a huge glass tower by disassembling it from the very top and bringing it down. Sure, it'd be great.
One of the reasons that these towers are unsustainable is because they have these high-tech glass skins with chemicals sandwiched in between the glass to give them some insulation and some sun resistance. And the lifespan of these panels is unknown. They're probably about 20 years, and then they're going to have to be completely replaced. So all that carbon in that panel will be thrown out, and the entire building will have to be reskinned, at which point there is an opportunity, even if you can't cut it down, at least you can give it a more sustainable, more beautiful skin than it has now. There's no such thing as a sustainable glass tower.
Thanks, John. Next question is Dave Akalis. What is the possibility of actually using the upcoming elections to change the zoning laws, which have not been updated since 1966?
Well, I think I would love to toss out our zoning code, all 1,400, 1,500, 1,800 pages of it, grind it up, throw it away, develop a form, what they call a form-based code, something like a little bit like what Joe Rose proposed, 1988, 1991. That would be better. I'm not sure there's consensus that that's the way to go. So I think it's a huge political task to build consensus among the city and the technocrats that needs doing. Maybe
Great.
John, somebody else has something to add to that. I don't.
But there's no way that Mayor Adams would do that, because the reason that Joe Rose's code was killed was because the Real Estate Board of New York called within half an hour and the code was dead. And as George pointed out, Mayor Adams is shuttling in and out to take money from developers. And they would say the same thing to him that they said to Giuliani, kill it, and he would kill it.
Yep.
I had some just breaking news in my conversation with Senator Hoylman today. He noted, often Vornado is saying, but we need the tax revenues from these 20 million feet of commercial space to pay for the renovation of Penn Station and Gateway. And Senator Hoylman point blank asked Jano Lieber, the head of the MTA, whether that was necessary and whether that was true, and the answer was no. So the whole notion that this is necessary, everyone hates Penn Station, but they're not changing that. But the whole notion that this will pay for Penn Station is a fiction.
Excellent. Thank you for that, George.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. Next question, Susan Hopper. Are there a variety of owners of the older buildings that house multiple small businesses, or has Vornado bought most of them? If a variety of owners remain, is anyone speaking with them about their views?
Well, there is that owner, the tall building, Lynn, we've been in touch with. I don't remember his name, but he's vehemently, I hope he's vehemently opposed and hasn't been paid off yet. You know who I'm talking about, who has a tall, one of the buildings right near the Hotel Pennsylvania and
just north. Yeah, just north of the Hotel Penn.
And he's opposed, and it's a big building.
So also one of our coalition partners, two of them, Eugene, and they are tenant leaders in rent stabilized housing. For example, there's a spectacularly beautiful former garment factory that's scheduled for demolition, and it's occupied by rent stabilized tenants. And they have been very, very active, to say we should not be roadkill for Vornado's project. And there's tenants in some of the smaller buildings as well who have also protested. And some of the ground floor businesses are very alarmed. And when I spoke to a few of them, they just feel like we're not being told anything. We're just being told that, we'll get some money, we'll be moved out. Like there's no discussion here.
Thanks, Lynn. Next question, anonymous attendee. We've covered this, I think, at last webinar, but it's important, so let's go over it again. What would be gained by moving Madison Square Garden, and what financial ramifications are involved? Is it currently connected with several subway lines?
Well, we went through 5 different sites of different character last week. So the sites vary in terms of the number of subway lines they would connect to, but not having a substantial subway line connected to them. If it were to be built at Hudson Yards in the inside of the Helix for the High Line, you have the 7 extension over there, and you also have a lot of ferries over there. If it were built further east, it conceivably could be at or near Herald or Greeley Square, although there are some problems with how that might impact historic buildings in that neighborhood, unless one could be adaptively reused in a garden redesign. There will be an expense to doing that. We believe it is a worthwhile expense, because we don't think you're ever going to, or the city or region are never going to have a properly functioning train station for 650 to 800,000 people if you're cramming them under 2 stories under a basketball hockey arena in order to preserve the incremental convenience of people who use that hockey and concert arena maybe 3 evenings a week. Sometimes it's dark space for even longer than that. So we think, yes, it has to happen. There will be an expense involved with that. There are air rights over the garden that could fund some of that, although we would only want that done if it were done properly and not to excuse the zoning code completely out the window. And there are other things that could perhaps be done to encourage the garden to move, including leveraging their tax abatement, which is not grandfathered in perpetuity, or their use permit. Their permission to use that as a sports arena ends in 2023. So it will take some great thinking, but I think once people land on that goal, they can build the finances around it, and they can do it in a way that makes sense, and particularly if the business community realizes that there are great benefits to them too, not just the grassroots clientele of the civics organization. You wind up with a better, more economically viable city, a more livable city. And if you want to stop losing employers to Atlanta or North Carolina or the Southwest, or London, Paris, Hong Kong, or Tokyo, that's the kind of thing you need to do.
Thanks, Sam. Next, Pamela Wolf asks, is it thinkable that in the next cataclysmic weather event, a glass tower will sway too far and topple? Wouldn't that make further construction be self-limiting?
Well, 432 Park is already falling apart without a cataclysmic weather event. They've got fires, they've got storms, they're suing, the elevators don't work. It's just a completely dysfunctional Raphael Vignoli, the first, big, super tall.
I think that the real estate industry is not a self-limiting industry. It doesn't self-regulate very well. And that really the challenge for civil society is how do we better regulate what they do to us? The current setup isn't really working.
Well, they're not regulating it, Lynn. Again, in the Times today, these buildings don't even have C of Os.
Right. But there is a system with C of Os, there's a system of zoning, there's a system of variances, there's a code, there's as of right rules. Like we have a whole setup of rules and stuff that just fail the public good and support them to do whatever they want. And we need to fix that.
Great. And last question from Kathy Slowinski. There is also a problem of birds dying by flying into glass buildings. There is proposed legislation for bird-friendly glass. Is this being considered for any of this development?
Well, you heard Lynn's bird chirping behind her during most of the presentation, so I hope she can answer that one.
I'm so sorry. I thought they were asleep way over there. So I don't know if Vornado is considering bird-friendly glass for its 10 towers. I do not know that. It might be buried in the environmental impact statement that they have, which is super thick. So it's worth taking a look to find the answer there.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. I think that pretty much wraps up the Q&A. Sam, you want to go ahead and add something?
Yeah, let me just close out. We really appreciate folks' attendance tonight and engagement. Many of you have been in touch with us between broadcasts, either to get the tape recordings of the broadcast, to forward to friends, or to watch yourselves. And we're really pleased with the quality of the dialogue and the Q&A. And I would just close with some a couple of comments. Obviously, we're deeply influenced by Jane Jacobs and her approach to this kind of activism. But I have another hero I wanted to talk about, who we all should inject into the mix, and that's Fiorello LaGuardia, who had a very interesting backdrop. And just bear with me for a second. He was a progressive Republican. His father was an Italian Catholic. His mother was Jewish and was from Trieste. I guess in order to reconcile that, they raised him as an Episcopalian. He, as many of you know, was an interpreter on Ellis Island and was fluent in Italian, Yiddish, and Croatian. I believe there were even more languages that he was fluent in. And he did wonderful, wonderful accomplishments. He unified the city's transit system, which is a precursor of some of the things that we have been recommending. He sponsored important labor legislation, and many, many New Deal victories were largely his responsibility. But the thing that I think when we're talking about human scale that I like to talk about Fiorello LaGuardia is, usually when we talk about housing projects, we say that with, I don't know, any numbers of negativities, but some of the finest public housing in the city was built or designed by Fiorello LaGuardia, the first houses that are on East 3rd Street. And they're tenement-sized buildings with large spaces in between. And what he did, and it's something that I think should guide our discussions and what we do with this, notwithstanding all the different projects he was involved with, he took special interest in this one, and he built it as if his own family would live there. And what a great design principle that would be, just in general. I mean, for the person who thought Penn Station might be too tall, it's certainly taller than the first houses on East 3rd Street. But it's a wonderful building, and I would take my family there, and I hope my children and grandchildren and many others can go there for a long, long period of time. That station was built to last 1,000 years, not 50. But the current Penn Station and its proposed replacement are not someplace I ever want to go to or ever want to bring a family member to, or even, I don't even want to bring any enemy there. And, you know, I think that this Empire Station proposal is a huge step backwards for the city. And I've said it will freeze frame in concrete for 50, 75, 100 years. Some of the worst urban design elements that this city has seen in a long time. And so many of it, we've learned already. We know it's wrong, that we really need to invest and rally our better selves. And while we don't, or I can't expect you all to speak Italian, Yiddish, and Croatian fluently, I think we all really want to create the greatest city that we can and leave something behind much better than what we found before. And I encourage you, while we're the small kids on the block, please keep doing that, because like that black and white picture I showed you, those buildings are mostly still there, and we can build something great where greatness once was and really make this a better city, and can all be very proud. And the elected officials and others are involved, we'll all have a great legacy. And we owe that to this city. We love this city, and it's really something that I intend to keep fighting for, and encourage the governor to take the same stance for this proposal that she just did with LaGuardia Air Train. So please stay in touch with us, keep us honest, and we really thank you for being part of tonight's program.
Thank you.